And we are live, Energy Week podcast. Ryan Ray alongside the good doctor herself, Dr. Ellen Wald. Dr. Wald, how is it in the beautiful state of Florida today?
It is a beautiful, sunshiny day. What can I say?
Yeah, it was 84 here yesterday. I don't know what's supposed to be today.
Nice.
It was 84, so nice and warm weather here in the great state of Texas. And so, any weekend reflections?
Let's see. I've been consumed with the fate of the baby birds that are occupying or living rent free in my grill. Basically, some birds decided to make a nest in my grill, and now there are four baby birds chirping for food. And I've become concerned about them because it's getting quite warm in there. According to the grill, it's about 200 degrees, and
Ooh.
yeah, I'm not quite sure what we're gonna do if those baby birds don't learn to fly real quick.
Well,
So.
the eviction moratorium was extended until June by the CDC, so I don't think you can actually kick them out.
Yeah, see, but also we've been letting them live there for, I mean, if you count when they were eggs,
Mhm,
I think they've lived there for at least 4 weeks. And once
mhm.
someone is living somewhere, I think I read about this, maybe it's just in New York, but then they're technically considered renters, even if they don't pay anything. And that makes it really hard to evict them. So,
We have a
uh,
right outside here's our front door. We had a bird nest, and they had their babies and all that. Of course, they pooped all by the front door. We let them go, and they're gone. So I got the pressure washer, sprayed the whole thing down because they're gone. And then now they've come back. They've come back this year. We're like, guys, we don't want you back. Like last year was cool. This year we don't want you here. They haven't got the memo though.
yeah, I think, I mean, I'm not really sure what to do. I mean, the problem was that the cover over the grill
Hmm.
broke and was destroyed, and we never got another one. So it's really on us. Like, we should have been covering the grill so the birds could have gotten inside. The problem is they're not very bright, and so I keep trying to leave the grill lid open to like give them some air, and the parent birds can't figure out how to get in to the grill, like how to go around the other side and see their nest. They can only enter one way, and it's like yesterday I was just watching them like fly around the grill and getting more and more in a tizzy with like food hanging out of their mouths. So anyway, it's been an interesting animal behavior science experiment.
Okay, well, let's see here. I just saw this right before we got on. I don't know if you've had a chance to see this or not. It says Iran's foreign minister says John Kerry told him about Israeli covert operation in Syria.
The story gets better because apparently the Washington Post knew about this and didn't print it.
You mean the what? You mean the Jeff Bezos owned Washington
Yeah.
Post didn't cover a Joe Biden scandal?
Yeah.
That's how you get a scandal-free administration. That's how it works. In case you're wondering, that's how scandal-free administrations work, right there.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So, yeah. So not only did he give give Iran information about where Israeli soldiers were, resulting in their deaths, but the Washington Post knew about it and didn't cover it. So, yeah, everything is great in the United States of America. Nothing to see
um,
here.
real quick, does democracy still die in darkness, or are we done with that? Like, is that whole thing
I think
over? Or
democracy dies in bright light.
I mean, because
Democracy is already dead. I mean, come on. It's
well,
dead now. We all live under the emergency orders, right? This is the state of emergency orders. This is what we live under.
you're wrong. The Washington Post still has their headline, their slogan as "Democracy dies in darkness." So I thought that was kind of ironic when they put it up, and it's even more ironic now that they're not reporting on major news stories. So I do know someone who is married to a reporter there, and even he chuckled at the fact that they came out with "Democracy dies in darkness" as he's like, yeah, okay, guys, it's a little
It's a
much there,
little overboard.
a
I
little more.
mean, I'm gonna steal that for my new dystopia novel because that sounds like something you'd read in like Hunger Games.
Hey, is your novel getting soon to be done? I know you.
Ha
Yeah.
no. Yeah, that's the unwritten, dystopia novel. The problem was that it actually started playing out in real life, and nobody wants to read about real life in fiction. So,
Okay,
yeah,
fair
fair
enough.
enough, right? Yeah.
Fair enough. All right, we do have a guest coming on today, so we will hop into it. Oil demand debacle in India as COVID-19 surge wreaks havoc. Dr. Wald, is this a concern for prices?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I picked this article and then a one from S&P Global, which I thought gave a much less panicky
Hmm.
view of
Hmm.
whether or not what's happening in India is actually going to affect global oil prices that much. So this headline is basically like, oh my God, India has the plague and demand is going to, die, and that means global oil demand is going to, what is the extended impact will likely ripple through the global market. So, okay, pop quiz for our listeners. What is India's oil demand? How many barrels per day does India consume?
It's not
Do
that.
we know? Yeah, it's not actually that much. I mean,
It's
I've written that India is like
like
I'm gonna get, it's
60th
like
in the world,
6.
but well, on a per capita, on a India, I got Indiana. That's not gonna work. Uh, so if you look at their per capita, India oil consumption per capita, let's see here. This is total. This isn't per capita, I don't think here. Um, Daily oil consumption is 4 million barrels.
Yeah, sorry, 4. I
Mhm.
overestimated by 2. Look at that.
Mhm.
Because here, okay, so
That's
yeah, so
4.6% of the
okay, so
global oil share.
interestingly, so India has to import almost all of its petroleum and petroleum
Mhm.
products because it has no natural resources.
Mhm.
And they were the third largest consumer of oil and petroleum products after the US and China in 2019. So it's not like we're talking small potatoes. However, like we're talking 4 million barrels a day. So how much do you think that is likely to even drop due to the plague running rampant in India? Which, by
Well,
the way, when they're like the most, just remember, it's like how many people live in India?
yeah, it's in the,
Like
well, that's what I said,
1.3
because
billion,
if you
right?
look at oil consumption per capita, and so the United States is 22nd at 61.02 barrels per day per 1,000 people. Okay, so India, for perspective, is 165th, 165
Yeah,
with 2.64. So when you look at their average consumer, how many people, how much they're using, it's just spread out over as what 1.3 billion or whatever it is people you're talking about. It's just spread out over a lot of people, right? So it's not the same as impact as it is with when Americans shut down.
exactly.
It
So,
takes
okay.
a huge volume to
Right. So India, yes, India is a big petroleum consumer. India is very important to pay attention to in the global market, but it's not going to be impacted the same way, say, US and Europe is, because its per capita oil consumption doesn't look like
right.
the US or Europe. So if you're thinking about, if you're using a US model to evaluate India, you're going to be wrong, basically, because
Right.
it's just not going to be like that. Um, However, but okay, so we have doom and gloom from, what is it, Financial Post publishing Bloomberg. Okay, so
Mhm.
doom and gloom. Oh my God, everything is going to go to shit now. What's OPEC going to do when the bottom falls out of the crude oil market? Right. That's okay. So now let's hop over to S&P Global Platts and see what they have to say. Okay, so far, Indian refiners have stayed away from slashing crude run rates sharply, despite the surge in COVID-19 cases to record highs. Okay, so far, they're still processing all that crude oil and turning it into petroleum products. Also, India uses a lot of fuel oil. Like I think they
Mhm.
use a lot more like and stuff for cooking than we do and stuff like that. So, or maybe like propane cylinder. I don't know exactly, but they don't like, they use a lot more. Okay. So, however, with a rise in regional lockdown, so it's not like the whole country's all locked down, which would be totally crazy because like India is a huge country, very diverse. Like, what are you going to do? Tell the people who live in the Himalayas that they have to lock down? It's
Mhm.
not going to work. Anyway, so, and they think there'll be an impact on mobility and industrial activity. They think that they might be forced to scale back crude runs in anticipation of a slowdown in oil demand. However, they also said that the run cuts may not be substantial as export demand for some oil products remain robust, with other regional economies and oil consumers showing a recovery trend. So they're basically saying, well, but they might decide not to cut back because they could just process it into gasoline or whatever and sell it elsewhere in the region because their demand is not being impacted, which is what I would definitely do if I was an Indian refiner. Unless as long as I didn't think that I was going to run out of storage space anytime soon, I would totally keep processing that stuff and sell it if I have to, or store it up because demand's going to come back. So I think that the big question is, what is OPEC going to think about this? Because if OPEC decides it's a real issue, they're meeting on Wednesday. And if this is like a big deal, OPEC could decide to scale back its planned production increases, which are supposed to take place in May. I don't see that as likely, but it's not unheard of because they're super into this idea that they can like tweak oil production as they wish. So I think it plays more into OPEC than I think.
Yeah, that'd be interesting because U.S. production seems to be on the rise, and if they were to roll back some of those numbers we saw for May, June, and July, I believe it is, the U.S. production is going to continue to be on the rise, and so it's not like it's going to slow that down any. This is one side here. This is in the Platts piece from ING Economics. It says lockdowns are easy, but arguably quite ineffective as means of stamping out COVID-19 in the world's most popular country.
I'm sorry. How can lockdowns be easy? Like a lot of people in India don't have an address. What are you going to do? Like, I'm sorry. Yeah. Lockdowns are easy,
but arguably quite ineffective.
They are quite ineffective. Lockdowns are, I don't care if I get banned from Twitter for saying this, lockdowns are totally ineffective. If you look at the data, you will see that they are totally ineffective in stopping the spread of a transmissible airborne virus. They don't.
By the way, that's what the WHO says as well, just so we're all clear. They agree.
They agree. The WHO did not pay me to say that. I said that on my own based on...
If they want to pay us to say it, we'll say
I actually have moral qualms about that, believe it or not. Generally, I don't have moral qualms about being paid by people, but yeah, I may draw the line there. I may draw the line at the WHO.
Ellen, you agree with this. I know. That's what's so crazy. Like, you agree. Listen, guys, I know I agree with you, but still, I can't. I just can't. I'm sorry. It's too much. It's too much.
Anyway, so I think I think it'll be interesting to see what OPEC decides. So they had their JTC meeting today, which is just a technical thing, and the JTC decided that they decided to leave their demand forecast unchanged. So they don't think this is going to affect the demand for the rest of the year, or if they do, they're not willing to actually say it.
Yeah, I would just think that if you're OPEC, you have to be like. They hit the ball of the park the first couple times, but at this point, can you nail the production predictions 3 times in a row? I don't know, maybe you can, but it would just seem that you've done really well. Like I was surprised at both of their moves. The first, I guess it's been 3 moves. This will be the 4th move. I was surprised in January, and then I was surprised again in was it March, and then now they start putting barrels back on the market. You're like, okay, that makes sense. So if they pulled away from that, maybe they can get it right again, but at some point you almost would think that they'd want to see how things play out a little bit more because to your point, the kind of month-to-month movement, I think has done a lot of good to control the U.S. production. But if they're not careful, they could become too self-assured in their ability to predict
things. Really? They could. They're not full of themselves at all.
What's the quote? Only Allah knows the price of oil. Or how does it go? Something like that.
Yeah. What was it? Naimi used to say. He used to say, "Only Allah knows the price of oil is." Or he also used to say that if he knew what the price was going to, only Allah knows what it will be. And he say if he knew what it would be, he would be in Vegas, not Vienna.
Him and me both.
Yeah, exactly.
Both. I would be at Vegas. I'd be at the beach, but still, whatever.
I think he meant like he'd be gambling on.
Oh well, I mean, yeah. I'd pay someone to go to Vegas to gamble for me, and I'll just
there you go.
No,
I feel like I've seen that movie.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. Newsom, State Attorney General, among those challenging the sale of oil and gas leases. Kern. Okay.
This got me a lot of hits on Twitter the other day. For me, I went viral, which for me is like 100 likes.
The only time I've gone viral was when Ted Cruz retweeted my interview with him. And it wasn't a good viral. I mean, they was all the
Oh,
bots
no.
were coming out and just crushing the tweet, and so I think I had I don't know how many I had, but
I
anyway.
went I once went viral with a totally like I think I kept getting this thing on across my browser on Twitter that said like you're using too much this web page is using too much memory, like closing it might increase your functionality. And so I like tweeted I was like and that went viral, which was a totally stupid reason. But yeah, I basically said I made some comment that uh they said Gavin Newsom tweeted, "New California is now the first state to declare an end to oil extraction in the country. Today, we're announcing that we will phase out all oil extraction as part of a world-leading effort to achieve carbon neutrality and ban fracking by 2024." So I think I said, this is basically Gavin Newsom saying, "We heart foreign oil. Saudi Arabia, send it to us." Yeah, I got 98 likes on that. So
Well, let me go
um,
find it, and I'll get you 99. So, can we just applaud California and say, if California wants to do this, let them do it. Let them do it. Like I think U.S. policy is controlled. We talk about being top down controlled. If California wants to make a blunder, then why do I want to stop them?
yeah, it's true. They're also apparently they think they're gonna lose a congressional seat because for the first time ever.
Oh, because of the
Because we did census in 2020.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah. But okay, so apparently, I don't know. It says that I mean, it's unclear whether like what Gavin Newsom actually tweeted is what's actually happening. Oh, this article is actually from November 9th. Huh. Okay. Well, there was another one that I think I had about this, but yeah, so I guess this was the result um of the review that they did. So it was interesting because I looked up who does a lot of like oil drilling in California, and Chevron. Gee, surprise, surprise, right?
mhm.
Because so I imagine that they might be upset about this.
So how much of this is Newsom still getting recalled? Is that going to
Oh
happen?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh
So
yeah, and do you know who's apparently they think could like replace him? Caitlyn Jenner, formerly known as Bruce Jenner. Ryan's trying not to laugh for those of us who are listening. He's trying really hard.
I did hear
Yeah.
those rumors.
Okay.
I did hear those
So
rumors.
I don't know. What do you think Caitlyn Jenner thinks about fracking? Do we know?
Didn't Caitlyn
That
endorse
didn't
Trump
come
in
up on.
2016?
I mean, I don't think that really came up that much on the Kardashians.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen a full season of the Kardashians. So I don't know, but didn't Caitlyn
I'll,
endorse Trump in 16 and then Biden in 2020?
I don't know. The truth is, I stopped watching like several years ago,
Yeah.
so I don't really like. I
After
was
the
like
car wreck where the
all
person
in.
died, that was kind of the last I heard.
That who died?
Uh, Caitlyn Jenner was a car wreck and it killed the person that was in there. That was
Oh, but also she wants to run for governor. I'm confused.
I
All
don't know.
right.
I
All right.
can't keep up. I cannot keep up with the Kardashians. So
Yeah. No.
sorry.
Well, Caitlyn Jenner is certainly welcome to come on the podcast and explain her views on fracking and oil extraction in the state of California. We would love that.
Oh boy. Oh, do you have any thoughts on this, Miss Wald?
Who's champ
I think it's
Chamath?
I think it's I see him on TV all the time. I think it's Chamath.
Oh,
He's the one who does all those SPACs. And if you see him, you would know who he is.
okay. I'm gonna look into it. I
Yeah.
know there are a lot of. I mean, I mean, look, it's California. There are a lot of.
Mhm.
The question is, in a recall election, did they just finish out the term, or is it a new term?
I think it. Oh. Yeah, I think they finished out the term, but I don't remember. It's been a while since I've studied up on California policies.
Yeah,
So,
it could be very interesting, but at the same time,
well,
I mean, we all know that California has super high gas prices that are due mostly to its crazy refinery policies and gasoline mix, which basically means that they have to um, they can only sell gasoline made in California to Californians. They can't get it from anywhere else because no one else wants to make their special formula. But I mean, I think that, I mean, it'll be interesting to see if they actually can do this or not. It's a lot of it reminded me kind of de Blasio's announcement. He's like, the New York City is only going to get its power from renewables. And I was like, well, how are they
Right.
going to do that? Because
Right.
they're part of New York State and they're part of the New York grid. And, it reminds me oh, let's make a big statement on Earth Day.
Yeah. Right. Well, Andrew Yang can take care of those problems when he wins.
Do you think he's going to win?
No, I don't. There was an article in the Times about last year where he was going through New York and was like trying to fill his street cred by doing New York things, and it was apparently to those. So I'm not a New Yorker, so I don't, like it's pretty obvious what I'm gonna say. Like he was going to places, and whatever he was saying, like the locals were like, "Yeah, you're obviously not one of us," and like he put a few gaffes. It's a whole New York thing. I had no idea. I would have made all those gaffes plus 100 more. So I really can't say. All I know is Mr. New York, Mr. Not New York. What are those Mr. Softies or whatever? Those ice creams.
Yeah.
That's kind of me in New York. That's really.
Oh yeah. Well, you basically got right down to the best part of New York, which is
And
Mr.
I had a Joe's Pizza, which I think is what you're supposed to do as well. So, okay, let's see. I think our guest is here. There
Excellent.
he is. Let me pull you up here on the big screen. Once again, joining us is Professor James Coleman at Energy Law Prof on Twitter. Mr. Coleman, good to have you today, sir. How are you doing?
Great. It's good to be here.
Thanks for coming back. We are very excited to have you on today, and welcome back, and to talk about something that has definitely been, we've definitely kind of been stumped by this, which is one of the reasons I thought it would be great to bring you on, because I think a lot of our listeners are also kind of unclear about this. Basically, we want to talk about what does it mean when we talk about like getting rid of subsidies for oil companies, because that is something that we see getting thrown around all the time. And maybe you could kind of bring us up to speed on what exactly are we talking about, first of all, when we say subsidies for oil companies, and then we can kind of get into what do some of the proposed changes mean for that.
Well, the first thing to say is it's not actually clear what people mean when they say the fossil fuel subsidies. So they mean a lot of different things. So, and really you will see, I have seen any number of news reports that basically describe different numbers for fossil fuel subsidies, and they all use different, they're using different measurements. So I guess like the first way of looking at subsidies would be to say, well, when is some company taxed less than I think would be wise? And that is actually probably the most common use. What people mean is, so often when they're talking about fossil fuel subsidies, what they mean specifically is they failure to adopt carbon taxes or carbon pricing. So there's an International Monetary Fund study that's been very influential, that's used in many of these news reports. That's basically the full value is how much should they be taxed for carbon, and they're not being taxed. Okay. I personally find that definition not helpful at all. And the reason is because there are as many people, there's 7 billion people in the world. I'm sure they would all have slightly different views on how much every company should be taxed. And that's not what I think people think one means when you talk about fossil fuel subsidies. So for that, I think there's two other definitions one could use. One is, and this would be kind of a tax professor perspective, is how much income in theory does the company have, which should represent its ability to pay. We have a corporate income tax. You should pay that income tax, right? And so the question is, are we allowing them to exclude things from income that really are part of their income? And then I can see the argument for that. We can talk about what that means in the specific things that we're talking about. And then the second argument is, or the third really, is how are they taxed compared to other industries, right? And to other uses of your money. So if the goal of the tax system is basically to be neutral and let people invest where they are and take money when they make profit, does it meet that neutrality standard? And I would say that those two second definitions are more helpful. I would say it is pretty neutral in the sense that there are some incentives for oil and gas production. They don't tend to be larger than the incentives for investment in any other industry. On the question of whether they are taxed at their full income level, that's a theoretical question for tax professors. We can get into it. We can talk about all the specific items that they're talking about. And it's a very complex question.
Let me ask this. So one of the things that you might say is maybe some categories, because obviously I'm not a CPA, but just general categories that we're talking about here, because those last 2 points that you make are quite helpful. So you're saying when you're comparing oil and gas to another industry, what would be a comparable industry? And then what are some of the high level categories that we're talking about to help the listeners understand how oil and gas might have a unique advantage or disadvantage when it comes to tax law? You're muted.
The obvious comparators would be the other energy industry sources, and we can talk about how it relates to renewable, the various subsidies that are available to renewable. Mining, I think, is actually probably the closest analogy. So other, mining for other things. And then sometimes people compare it to manufacturing, and they say, well, it's more like a manufacturing process. And so how does it compare to that? And I think the reason people are talking about it right now is because President Biden says he wants agencies to get rid of these and get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, whatever those might be. And he also says that he wants to get rid of those maybe as part of the infrastructure bill, as part of the, the pay for, right? I think there it's important to understand federal agencies do things that impact the profitability of oil companies, but they don't really do the taxes. So they're not, in most conventional definitions of a subsidy, they're not involved. So the real question would be, is Congress going to pass something that's going to change the tax treatment of oil and gas companies? And I think there it's worth noting that there have been proposals going back 70 years trying to change that. And it has changed it several times. Oil and gas tax treatment has gotten less favorable, but there have been efforts to remove the specific deductions that one might complain about that are sometimes put in the category of fossil fuel subsidies. Mm-hmm. And I think, there's an open question about whether this effort would be more successful than those past ones.
So let me ask one quick question here, and I'll let Ellen hop in. We're talking about oil and gas companies. Are you talking about operators, midstream companies, refiners, companies that encompass all? Because as we know, there's a lot of different moving parts here. So before we kind of move into the tax portion, does it matter? Does this apply equally across the board? I don't know, but just a question as I'm thinking about you talking about this stuff, the tax on a midstream company versus an operator or a company that has both. Is there any real difference there?
Mostly people are talking about upstream is what they mean, but it is true. I mean, actually so there is one part of there is one U.S. government policy that pretty much amounts to a fossil fuel subsidy, and that is the low-income home energy assistance program. But that's basically just helps people pay their heating bills, especially during the winter. Very few people are looking to get rid of that program. Now, that's an indication, though, of helping somebody at the very downstream may have a beneficial impact for people upstream. So there is stuff throughout the upstream, midstream, downstream. But I think when people are talking about fossil fuel subsidies, mostly what they're looking to get rid of are upstream. They're trying to change certain upstream tax treatment.
So I had two specific-ish kind of questions, but you kind of addressed one of them already, which is that the Biden administration has maybe addressed federal agencies to do certain things. And so my question really was kind of without legislation, without actual act by Congress, what could the Biden administration through different agencies, maybe even through the IRS, do to kind of cut down these tax breaks? So is there anything they could do, and what would be the process? Would it include the normal kind of comment, rule and comment process, or are we talking about just, kind of individual rulings?
Well, there's a lot that you can do to impact it on the margins, and maybe it's helpful. So generally when you're reading press things about fossil fuel subsidies, the two sort of confusing things that sometimes people do if you were to look into those studies. One is that people, again, include, well, we should have a carbon tax. And if we don't, anything that we have that's not a carbon tax, that's a huge fossil fuel subsidy. I mean, the Biden administration isn't proposing a big carbon tax. I don't think that's very likely. So if that's what fossil fuel subsidy means, I don't think it's going away. And also, I don't think it's a helpful definition. The other thing, and this is a University of Texas study that gets cited all the time, which to me doesn't make much sense, is they're talking about royalty rates, or really severance. They're talking about severance taxes. And so, they say, well, we've actually at various points reduced those severance taxes on oil and gas operators, for shale wells or for other wells, and that amounts to a subsidy. Now, the interesting thing there is, remember, a severance tax is over and above all the other taxes that you pay, right? So a severance tax, in some ways, if you have any severance tax at all, anything above zero, that is a suggestion that you're not subsidized. It's the opposite of a subsidy. Wind doesn't pay a severance tax. Now, with that said, I'm not saying you shouldn't have severance taxes. Severance taxes is a very good argument for them, which is that, it's basically you can. And that may sound like a frivolous argument, but it's actually a pretty good argument in tax policy, which is to say, if you can tax something without preventing people from investing in it, that's actually a great tax, because normally we tax things like work, that people can always work less on the margin or get less income on the margin. And so it makes more sense to tax things that people won't stop. And that's the idea of a severance tax. And so they're pretty common. We don't use them with wind and solar. So you could say, I guess, if there's just not a clear level of what level of severance tax is correct. And remember that a severance tax is for a state basically the analogy of a royalty, right? The royalty is the same thing. You have the right to permit or not development on this property, whether you're a government or a person, and you say, in return for your right to produce, I'm going to take a percentage of production. That's what a severance tax does. That's what a royalty does. How you calculate that, what the optimal level is, very, very complex. I have a recent article on that, Third Age of Oil and Gas Law. I did that for province of Alberta, where we kind of set their new royalty system. That is it's incredibly complex, very difficult to optimize, but there's a theoretical optimum level. Okay, the Biden administration will have a lot of influence on how royalties are calculated going forward on federal land. And they can even try and impact on new, remember, there's two things. One is they have this permitting pause, right? This leasing pause. And when they come out of that, they may have new policies for how they lease federal land, or they may just not do it, or they may do it very slowly. With respect to older leases, they can change the way that they try to calculate what royalty needs to be paid by changing, what costs you can deduct in terms of natural gas, arguing for new interpretations of that. And so they have a lot of ability to try and extract more money at the margins. Now, to me, none of that is about subsidies, right? Because subsidies, that's a tax code thing. It's about, and it's defined with respect to income. Anything severance tax, any royalty, that's on top of that. That's extra money you're getting from the oil and gas industry. But it is a way that you could potentially get more money out of the oil industry. Now, as somebody who helped create those for the government of Alberta, I can tell you it's really complicated, and there's often circumstances where, if you try to raise those, because remember, the whole point of it is you're going after something where there's economic rent, right? There's basically value just sitting there that you can take a piece of. But if you try to take too much of it, you stop investment and you actually lose. So unlike, it's hard to, people talk about the Laffer curve for income, or capital taxation can be hard to get above that, but it's very easy to get above that with royalty income. So if you're thinking about what's the government maximizing revenue, that's complicated. It's not clear in all those cases that you can get more money, that you can get more money at all, right? Often you're pretty close to that theoretical maximum. Now, if your goal is to harm oil and gas companies and not to get more money, that's easy to do, right? Just raise the money.
Okay.
You go ahead.
Here real quick. Let's see here about bankruptcy. Many E&P companies filed for bankruptcy or loss last year. How can they pay for anything? So how would that apply for companies who are claiming losses or bankruptcies over the past year with the tax code? Is it anything special about oil and gas, or is it the same policy in general?
If they don't have income, right? They can't pay tax. They still have to pay severance tax. So, to the extent, and that does limit their cash flow. But yeah, they don't pay. They won't be paying income tax. And in fact, yeah, so it's not as simple as lack of having net negative cash flow means you don't have to pay income tax. If you are investing in new properties, the government will often say, well, you clearly have some ability to pay because you're purchasing new properties, even though you have less money than you started the year with. And so therefore you have to pay taxation. That gets into the capitalization rules, which we can absolutely talk about. We will have to, if we want to talk about, intangible or depreciate percentage deduction or all the sort of technical tax process for oil and gas.
Yeah, and one more quick thing on the royalty before we move on is you mentioned on Texas Oil and Gas Podcast, I brought this up the other day, that if they are going to restructure the royalty payments for the BLM lands, that could effectively cut out companies wanting to drill there because it's not profitable. How much margin is there in these royalty agreements that the government could actually charge these companies when companies continue to stay profitable or interested in drilling in these BLM lands at current prices? Do you have any gauge on that? Because that could be an effective way to stop drilling is, well, we'll give you the lease, but the royalty increase and therefore it's not profitable.
That's an incredibly complex. I mean, so, I can tell, having done it for Alberta, we had a bunch of consultants come in, look at it, versus like, what's your return on capital here versus elsewhere. I am sure there are profitable wells where you could raise your recovery and it would be, and they would continue to operate. I mean, I'm sure there's thousands of those. However, it doesn't help if you end up losing more money on the operations that shut down. So it's a very complex, and frankly, I would say that the U.S. royalty system is very antiquated, sort of like our tax code. It's built of like a bunch of tiny little fixes on tiny little fixes that leaves a lot of corners where it's not very rational. By contrast, what we tried to do in Alberta is like come up with a unified scheme that worked for most properties. But the U.S. has a very, very old school royalty system. I mean, that still sort of grows out of everything. It's always a 1/8 royalty, right? I mean, frankly, like individual landowners have a much more sophisticated process. Like big landowners, if you were looking South Texas, have a much more sophisticated process for extracting revenue from oil and gas companies than the federal government does. So yeah, I think we're probably up against the edge. It's hard for me to believe that they're going to get more money without a sort of a big overhaul. But again, if the goal isn't to get more money, but is to discourage fossil fuel production, just raising the rate helps because shutting down some producers, even if it means less revenue for you, is a bonus for that policy goal.
Sorry. So I actually had someone send me a question, a very technical question. I don't know if you can answer it, and if you don't want to, that's fine. But I had a listener send me a question, ask if the tax break for intangible drilling costs should apply to non-exploratory wells like shale.
So let me
maybe you could unpack that.
Yeah, let me unpack that because I think it's worth talking about. At least there are about 20 provisions that people describe as tax expenditures or subsidies for oil and gas. And let me just talk about two because they're the two biggest ones and they're the ones that you hear the most about. So one is this question of well, they both relate to this. They both relate to the same thing. So maybe actually I'll address the intangible one first. So if you are a taxpayer, you're a company, and let's say that you have a bunch of factories, you make $20 million a year. But one year you decide to expand your business. And so you decide to spend $20 million on a new factory, right? So you have $20 million in net revenue. You spent it all on a new factory. You want to tell the government, I have $0 in income this year because I got all that money, but I spent it on a new factory. Now, historically, what the government has said is if you've got money to spend on a new factory, you have money to pay us. And in fact, it's not like that was a $20 million, payment for some, fuel that you use during the year, or a one-time payment to a CEO or otherwise. This was a choice to buy something, and now your business is worth more as a result. So you really had $20 million in net revenue during this period of time. Now, we'll admit that facility you bought won't last forever, right? Maybe it'll only last 30 years, 20 years, 10 years. And so over time, we'll make you capitalize that expense, which means we're not going to let you treat that as a cost this year. You're still going to pay tax on $20 million in income. But every year, we'll say that that facility is worth less. So $1 million every year for 20 years. So you get $1 million off every year for your taxes. Now, you might say, what does that even matter? That is not it's because either way, you're getting that $20 million off eventually. But of course, the time value of money means you'd rather have the tax break now rather than spread out over 20 years. And so the government, could say you'll recover that over 20 years. That's in theory what income tax should want you to do. In practice, the government never does that. For most resources, or very rarely, for most things that you spend money on, it's going to make you recover it over 5 years, 7 years, maybe 20 years, maybe 15 years. It really depends, but they're typically not going to do that. Now, for oil and gas, there's a slightly different provision, which says, okay, so often oil and gas companies, upstream companies, are investing in new wells. And when they buy those wells, they're investing for things that are going to stay there. They have steel pipe, they've drilled, et cetera. Everything that they have is there. But they're also, paying the salaries of employees and paying for things that are just like a regular part of their business process, like clearing the land. They are, the wages of the employees who work there. Now, they could allocate all that and say, well, a portion of everybody's time and all this equipment really went into building this well, and so therefore I should be required to capitalize all that expense. So I can't deduct that from my income. In practice, what they do instead is they say, okay, yeah, I'll capitalize, like I don't get the tax break right now on all the steel and concrete and everything that I built there, but like all those intangible costs, like clearing the land, people's time, et cetera, I get to deduct that right now. Okay. So that's kind of an advantage because you get to deduct that a little bit sooner. Now, all of this is frankly not that big a deal right now because we've also, there are so many tax incentives allowing you to deduct your income, your expenses, capital expenditures faster. There's just 1 year deductibility under the recent tax cuts, et cetera. This is really not a big deal. So the argument that the listener is making is, well, that historically, that same year deductibility for intangible costs was because you're investing in this factory. But it's an oil well and you don't know whether it's going to produce or not. So you shouldn't be, but nowadays we know whether it's going to produce because we have a good sense with shale. But it's the basic same problem, which is you don't know if it's going to produce enough oil and gas to pay for the expenses that you're going to be able to recover those costs over time. So instead, we allow the bulk of it to be recovered up front. So I think it is a little bit different when it's a less uncertain process, but I don't think it affects the fundamental argument. And it's not that different with how we treat investments in other sectors, which typically we allow some kind of accelerated depreciation or accelerated cost recovery.
Okay, so I got a question, and it might be nothing here. I'm just curious. We talked about ducts as far as it pertains to oil production. Is there any kind of tax deference or something when you're drilling a well and you say, you know what, we're not going to finish it now, we're going to finish it next year? Does that help, hurt? Does it matter at all? Because there's a lot of questions about why there are ducts, and we don't get into that. But I'm just curious from a tax standpoint, is there any benefit to having a duct or to finishing the well today? Obviously, from the monetary side, you can make more money if you finish the well, but from a tax standpoint, is there any benefit to not completing the well?
Okay, let me answer that question simply and then more complicatedly. So first, no, not necessarily, right? I mean, generally, the Well, as soon as you get income, you're going to have to pay tax, but you want income. So generally, and you're going to get the deduction when you have income to deduct that cost against, right? So yeah, if you're not making any money this year, it doesn't necessarily help you that there's no reason to worry about your deductions because you're not paying any tax, right? On the other hand, if let's say you made an investment in the past and now you want to carry it forward as a deduction, that's a you can sometimes do that. There are also your question can get very complicated when you're dealing with issues like you have to choose whether you're going to capitalize this expense or not. You have to choose it by the end of the year. If you don't frankly know how much oil and gas you're going to get from this well, having that uncertainty can be potentially a problem. So there are circumstances when the uncertainty would potentially be an issue and might matter.
I got one more, Ellen, or do you have one? Okay, so I know, especially like with pipeline companies, but producers as well can buy mitigation units to offset either carbon or wetlands or stuff like that. Is that something that's unique to oil and gas because we see it maybe more frequently, or would that be some kind of unique? It's not necessarily a subsidy, but is there an added tax benefit for that? How does that play out in the grand scheme of the tax scenario?
You mean how do your expenditures? Do I get to deduct those expenditures?
Well, it's like let's say you're going to build a pipeline through a wetland. You got to go buy your wetland mitigation credits. So I know, like out in West Texas, there's certain type of environmental impacts, and they had to go buy mitigation credits for that. Is that any kind of unique thing to the oil and gas tax code that you wouldn't see? Because you're not going to build a big warehouse in the middle of West Texas, but there might be some kind of environmental impact that you could go and get mitigation credits, and then can you offset as taxes? Is that something unique? Obviously, theoretically, anyone could have it, but it's primarily would be something that you would see in the oil and gas or maybe mining industry.
Right. Well, you see it in transmission too, in power transmission.
Right.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would assume that you could deduct that in the immediately, right? That's like your regular cost of doing business. It's not a capital expense. You're not expecting continued revenue from this wetland that you saved. However, I suppose I could see an argument, maybe this will be the new fancy argument for that. That's a subsidy for oil and gas, because you'd say, well, really the wetland, like your oil and gas well came with that wetland. So as long as that wetland, as long as the oil and gas is pumping, that wetland continues to give you value. So whatever you paid for the wetland, you should have to deduct it over 20 years or whatever. I mean, one could make that argument. I'm not aware that anybody has.
But you don't get like an extra tax credit for buying those mitigation units.
There could be, but I'm not aware of ones in Texas for extra tax. I mean, that rate. So like this, another. If you were to compare, so the treatment of oil and gas is very similar to the treatment of other mining industries. Slightly less favorable for. I mean, there are certain like low value things like gravel that you just have to treat very favorably, otherwise they wouldn't happen. But it's less favorable than for things like lithium or otherwise. When people are thinking of subsidies, I do think they're thinking of what goes on in the renewable energy space, which is like literally if you invest in something, the government just gives you money back. They give you a tax credit on your taxes. There's very little like that. I'm trying to think of any of the examples like that in oil and gas. So you don't get that kind of. So I think sometimes people in their mind have it's like, oh, it's a simple subsidy like the production tax credit for wind. And it's not that. We don't have that in oil and gas.
Dr. Wald, anything else? If not, we can ask him how to get our taxes down to $750 a year like Donald Trump. So I'll let you. That's my last question if you don't have one.
No, this has been very, very enlightening, and I'm wondering what do you think the chances are that the Biden administration will be successful in getting any kind of legislation that maybe, I mean, it seems like they could use maybe an overhaul in the tax process. Anyway, what do you think maybe the chances are of getting any kind of legislation that impacts fossil fuel company taxes at all is?
I think it's high that you would see something because this Congress has constantly played with these. So the other big tax expenditure, fossil fuel subsidy is is the idea that when you sell oil and gas, you're allowed to your well is all of a sudden less valuable because you took some of the oil out of it, and so you're allowed to deduct what you gave up. And if you were a store owner, you'd say, well, I had some I had something that I invested in, and then I sold it, so I don't have that inventory anymore. What they allow you to do is deduct a percentage of your income. Now, both that provision and the provision of intangible drilling costs are limited, very limited, for big oil companies, right? So mostly these provisions just benefit small companies and independent producers. And so, it's not. Those independent producers, they probably punch above their weight in sort of their political influence. And so I would be, but that narrowing of it, where it mostly doesn't apply to the big producers, that is absolute. That's because it's changed over time. And the percent depletion deduction used to be 27%, and now it's 15%. So these things have gotten kind of ratcheted down over time, and I wouldn't be shocked if they got ratcheted down a little bit. I would be shocked if they got eliminated, because we don't eliminate them for any of the sort of manufacturing. Frankly, people have been talking about getting rid of the renewable subsidies forever, and they just keep getting bigger. So it's really hard to, if you wanted to get rid of these tax expenditures. There are some kind of like reform times when they do that. Tax in 1986, they did that. But it's been a long time, and I think it's a little bit unlikely. It's interesting that the first time they tried to get rid of this that I'm aware of was President Roosevelt vetoed it. So like the first time they came after these, he passed Congress, but President Roosevelt vetoed it, and it's been, if you want to read something substantive about this, I would recommend going back to like the law review articles written in the 1950s about this. There's all these big debates in the Harvard Law Review. It's crazy.
I was going to which President Roosevelt, but I'm assuming you're talking about Franklin Delano, not.
Yeah,
Teddy.
Franklin Delano. Because remember, I think FDR passed the first income tax, but when he did it, he just sent. He couldn't figure out how to pay it, and so he just sent a check. He just sent a check to the Treasury and said, "I assume this is enough. If it's not, come back to me." I'm sure all of us wish we could pay our taxes that way.
I kind of feel like that's sometimes how we do it, except we send them, is this enough? Is this right? Tell me.
Yeah, hopefully there will be a podcast subsidy for all the congressmen and tax advisors to the government. We need a full podcast subsidy. Basically, I would say 90% of your reportable taxes per 1 hour podcasting you do per year, and we can write that off for generations to come. So, Professor Coleman, it is at Energy Law Profits, PROF, on Twitter. Where else might you want to send folks who want to follow your lovely work?
Well, you can follow me on YouTube. I'm doing Clubhouse these days. You guys do Clubhouse?
I've been on there. I've done one.
Okay. Well,
I'm
if you ever want to
getting
get together,
into it.
if you guys ever want to get together, just let me know.
Let's do a Clubhouse. That sounds lovely. It was good to get you on again. Thank you so much. And we will talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
All right, Dr. Wald. Okay. Let's see here. I believe that is it. Thanks again to Mr. Coleman for coming on. Answer the tax questions. I love getting the tax guy on, because the tax guy or gal is the one person like you can just constantly throw out hypotheticals. And they're like, well, I don't know, maybe they're trying to work out this big. I just envision like this big flow chart of all the if-then variables that they're working through. Which is why taxes scare me to death, because
oh yeah,
Oh, good.
absolutely. Which is amusing, because the family business of my ancestors, I mean like 2 generations back, was their accountants. So you'd think maybe I wouldn't be so terrified of taxes. I actually find old tax stuff kind of interesting. I actually wrote quite a bit in my dissertation about how Aramco tried to get out of paying its American taxes when the Saudis decided to institute taxes on them, and they had to try to convince the IRS that what they were paying the Saudis qualified as an income tax, when in reality it was very fishy on whether or not that was actually an income tax.
All right. Well, we will let you go with this from Man United fan If you haven't checked out Kinder Morgan earnings, I recommend to check it. They took huge advantage of the winter storm. So
Ugh.
there's some research for the folks this week. Until next time, we're back next week, right? Yeah, back next week.
Yeah.
And we'll talk to you then.